Welcome back. OmniDan has asked me to have a look at one of the Atheist Experience videos called the Atheist Experience 2611 with Shannon Q and Phil Ferguson. Now it's quite a long video, 1 hour 48, but Dan only asked me to have a look at a certain part of it where I believe they discussed near-death experiences to some degree. It's Miracles Prove God, that section of it, so I'm just going to have a look and give you my thoughts.
I believe in Kevin. Hi, Kevin.
Hello.
Welcome. Hey.
Kevin, he, him from Canada.
Hey.
You gave that much time to... Hi.
Hi.
If you gave that much time to make fun of the last guy, you can give me 3 minutes to read my what I posted today about miracles and the proof of God.
I don't know. We're not going to have it. No, we don't. This isn't a negotiation. We're not having a 3-minute speech right now. If you would like to have a
making courtesy, what
right.
happened
I know.
there? I mean, I demand that you must do this on your show.
And for the record, he would have had significantly more time if any of that had made any sense. So, like, just start with making sense, and then we'll go from there. What would you like to talk about?
Sure. I'll just start. I believe recorded miracles and near-death experiences, many of which are witnessed by doctors, are the...
Near-death experiences are not miracles. Depends how you define miracles, really. I don't believe in miracles as such. Near-death experiences are currently unexplainable by modern neuroscience and more modern science, at least many aspects of them are. They're not miracles, they're part of the natural phenomena of human experience, but as of yet has not been explained. So, not a miracle, just something we don't understand.
Proof God exists. The reason why miracles are unexplained and cannot be reproduced is because God is the only one who can cause them to happen.
Near-death experiences do also not prove that God exists whatsoever, nor do they prove any religion is correct over any other belief system.
The reason why there is no other physical proof of God is because God is a physical being.
He's not presenting anything. Yeah. That doesn't...
Well, he is presenting. He's reading his presentation.
Make for a fun conversation, Kevin. We're not here just to hear you rant for 3 minutes.
Not ranting. He's just giving his opinion through for you to then respond to afterwards. I'd say Phil's been a little bit harsh here.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, that was it. Well, I can do a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Okay.
it. You said that was it.
Well, I could read another 2 paragraphs if you want, but
yeah, I could sit and read the Bible to you. Why would we want to do that? Just tell us what you believe in your own words.
Posted in
I
just wrote this today on Facebook.
Okay, so you believe that God is the only person who can perform miracles, right? Like, so that's where you landed at the end there.
You'd have to first determine if miracles exist and then understand the cause of them. I don't believe miracles take place. I believe that everything is explainable by science and by the human understanding of the way the world works. However, I believe that way in which the world works is far removed from what we currently understand right now. With near-death experiences, I believe that they do give strong evidence that's, well, not just near-death, but a collaboration of various different forms of evidence, I think is strong to suggest that consciousness may not be limited to the physical brain and the working physical brain. That doesn't mean it's a miracle. It means it's a part of nature, a part of science, and a part of the world and the universe and reality that as of yet is unexplainable by humankind, but will be with more science, not by God does it and we can never explain it. I don't think that's the case.
So obviously you believe miracles take place and that the reason that they take place is because of God. So you are and you believe that something like a near-death experience is a miracle, obviously. It's like, am I understanding you correctly?
That would come, that view that near-death experiences are a miracle would come from a biased perspective to begin with. So this Kevin from Canada already believes that God exists. He's doing it from a top down, so he's looking for evidence to support his preconceived belief. So of course near-death experiences to him would be proof of God and therefore must be a miracle. He hasn't come at it from a scientific point of view, looking at the research and the scholarly work done on the subject and ways of trying to explain it and various theories that have come forth from it, whether it be physical theories or theories of non-physical nature of consciousness, both of which are a scientific point of view and a philosophical point of view, of course.
That's fair.
People having out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences when they can record what's going on around them outside of their body from a different perspective.
You can't record when you're out of body because There's no means by which you record unless you record by memory, I suppose, and then come back and report it later. But I think what he's talking about here is veridical perception, where someone allegedly out of their body can see things that they should be able to see. Or people that are out of their body can allegedly see things accurately that they shouldn't be able to see due to their brain state, their current brain state, or just their physical location in reality, which basically is a fancy way of saying maybe something in the next room or in the next state, even in some cases, and then come back and tell about that perception, which is then verified by a third party, a doctor or a bedside companion or something like that. That's what he means.
Record.
Outside their body.
I missed that bit now, sorry.
What do you mean record?
Outside their body. They can
take my phone with me and record?
When they're dead, and when they're dead on the hospital bed, they can tell the doctors what they were talking about, what was going on.
He means clinically dead, as in not irreversibly dead. It's a matter of definitions. All we're interested in is what is the brain doing? Can the brain be recorded to say what it's doing? Should it be able to produce consciousness? Was there consciousness? Can we corroborate the timing of that? So whether you were dead, irreversibly dead, clinically dead, brain dead, whatever you want to call it, all we're interested in is what was the brain doing at that time and when did the perception take place and was it veridical?
On in the hospital room at the time of their death while they're outside their body observing this.
They're not really dead though, right? Like, because if you're dead, you're dead. There's not like gradients of dead. There's
how is it recorded? I got lost in recorded. You said they can record things.
When Shannon says that you're either dead or you're not, you can go along with that. That's true. However, death is a process. It's not an on. You're suddenly one stage you're alive, then you're dead. It is, I suppose, kind of a gradient. It's a process that takes a lot longer than previously thought. I can't remember the name of the paper. Sam Parnia. It might have been part of the AWARE study that shows that death is a progression, a natural process that takes a longer time. However, again, whether we're irreversibly dead, clinically dead, brain dead, whatever you want to call that state, all we're interested in is what is the brain doing? Should this be able to take place in physical terms? In many cases, there is no explanation as to how perceptions that happen take place. Phil's getting hung up on the whole idea of recording. I'll just let that point go. We know what he means. He's talking about veridical perception.
Things out of their body. What did they record with?
No. They can't. That's another part of it. We can't use instruments.
Kevin's just getting confused over terminology here.
To record God or the spiritual world, because our instruments are made for this potentiality. We can't have instruments.
Are you saying that you were in error by using the word record and I should just move on from that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes?
The people who are having NDE, who are dead outside of their bodies, still alive in a spiritual body, can...
Also important to note that not all near-death experiences report the out-of-body stage. Sometimes it's a big array of... they're all very common, commonly occurring, by which I mean common between near-death experiences, so they all share common ground, common narratives, common timelines, and common factors. However, not all of them include every part of that, so not everybody... In fact, I believe it's quite rare to experience the light at the end of the tunnel. It's more common, I think, to have an out-of-body experience, but it doesn't happen for everybody. And I'm not particularly interested in those because they're subjective. They can't be verified, really, unless there is veridical perception in those experiences, such as somebody who meets a dead relative who tells them something they shouldn't possibly have known, and they go back and verify it. That's a different... although it's within a near-death experience, that's kind of a different phenomena in and of itself. But those that just have the light travelling to places on different realms or whatever that are far removed from a physical reality, there's no way of really verifying that took place anywhere outside of the imagination. It may not be. It might be objectively a real place they're going to. We just can't provide evidence for that, which is why I'm only really interested in those with veridical perception.
Record and tell you what happened at the time.
What are they recording with?
They were dead on.
Move on. It doesn't matter. We know what he means.
I use the wrong word.
English your first language, Kevin? I want to make sure before
I think he means like recount, like they can recall and then articulate.
Recall?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was quite a cheap shot there from Phil. Unnecessary, unprofessional.
Yeah, that's what I think he means.
Okay, so you don't mean record then?
Yeah.
Record in memory and pass on to the people to verify.
Yeah. So they can testify what
Leave
their
it, Phil.
experience is. So if you ask them, they can say, I had X experience. That's kind of what you mean?
Yeah, you can always say I had this near-death experience, but again, unless it has that veridical perception part of it, we can't really verify any experience they have. I can say I dreamt last night about going to the shops and flying through the roof, coming back down and throwing pineapples at everybody. That could be perfectly true, but I can't verify that. Whereas if I come out of my body, I go down the street, and this has happened, go down the street, look at a car registration. Who was it I spoke to recently? Oh, it was Luis Maniero, who had an experience exactly the same as this. He came out of his body, saw a car registration number plate that he didn't recognise, not a car he knew, remembered, recorded in memory to set aside Phil, recorded in his memory the unfamiliar number plate or registration number, whatever it is in America, came back, wrote it down or recorded it in whatever way, then went out physically and confirmed it was there. That's what I'm interested in.
Right?
Yeah.
Or I feel like I saw this, I heard this, I felt this, those sorts of things. Right?
They remember being in their spiritual astral body outside of their physical bodies.
No evidence to show that there is really a body that you experience after death or in a out-of-body state. It's just that your point of reference becomes somewhere outside of the body, whether you're in a body, whether you're a point of consciousness, whether it's all in your head. We don't know. I think the latter is unlikely due to the veridical perception aspect. And what I will say is I will refer you to a book called The Self Does Not Die, and by Titus Rivers, Annie Dervin and Rudolf Smith, which notes down 100+ case studies. And these are not anecdotes, these are verified case studies of third-party verified out-of-body perceptions that took place, many of which took place while the brain scan that was taking place during the procedure or whatever it was registering 0, and that means there's no cortical activity. And of course the cortex of the brain, as I'm sure Shannon knows, is thought to be responsible for the higher cognitive functions of human beings, which would mean effectively the sentient part of our ability to understand the world around us in a logical understanding fashion, I suppose. So effectively without the cortex being there should be no intense richness of experience, which there is in some of these cases in The Self Does Not Die. So read that book, it's very important.
While watching what the doctors are doing and saying while they're resuscitating them.
Okay, all right. So I'm with you on that. Now, is it possible that experience that they're having, like, are you willing to entertain the possibility that experience that they had, that perceptual experience, wasn't actually them outside of their physical body?
In many cases, that will be the case. Drug-induced kind of hallucinatory experiences during anesthesia or various other drugs. I mean, you're given a lot of drugs a lot of the time throughout some of these procedures. I mean, anesthetics themselves are a mixture of all sorts of chemicals which can mess with your mind and cause some form of hallucinations, many of which may include being out of the body. I know that Olaf Blunk and his experiments with the human brain, he stimulated a part of the brain called the temporal parietal junction, which caused the illusion of being out of the physical body. So if there's some kind of activation of that area for whatever reason, chemically or electrically or whatever, during a procedure, that could then cause a hallucination of being out of the physical body. Doesn't mean that is the case for all out-of-body experiences, especially those, again, and I come back to with veridical perception, because that shouldn't happen, and it does.
I mean, you could say it's a chemical reaction in their brain making them have psychosis or whatnot. But
no. Okay, no.
Thing.
I'm gonna the brain scientist in me is having a nervous breakdown right now, because you can't psychosis.
The use of the word psychosis is just the ignorance of Kevin to how the brain works. I mean, anybody that doesn't understand the difference between psychosis and hallucinatory experiences like that, that's not Kevin's fault. That's just him not being a neuroscientist or not having kind of a academic interest in how the brain works. Most people wouldn't define psychosis properly. They'd think that anything that's unusual about the brain or unusual in experience that's caused by the brain would call it psychosis, just as a layperson.
Psychosis is not.
That's something else.
That's dramatically different. So we're talking about perceptual anomalies, right? So we're talking about people having perceptual anomalies while they're in an unconscious state. That's not psychosis. It's not uncommon. It's basically what a dream is. The only difference is when somebody has a near-death experience. And I think you also conflated several terms as well, because you said they are dead and they come back to life. There is no coming back to life once you're dead. Otherwise, resurrections would be
Definitions.
commonplace and Jesus wouldn't be so freaking special, right? Like, you're either dead or you're not dead. So, and then your other conflation in terms is saying that people are having out-of-body experiences when they haven't even flatlined, which is, I think, what you're talking to, which isn't actual death. Actual death is the prevention of sodium and ion transmission across the nucleic cell membrane in the neurons in your brain.
She's quite right. We shouldn't really take much interest in near-death experiences that occur when we know the brain is still active, because there can always be an explanation to how changes in the brain or how any kind of activity in the brain could give rise to conscious experience. While there's brain activity, there is potential for consciousness. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not sure what Shannon means in terms of the lack of sodium in the cell membranes or whatever. I understand kind of very basically, but Shannon's by far the expert in that. I'll have to look up how that works, because that's very interesting. But point being, flat EEG, there shouldn't be no conscious experience. If there is still activity in the brain, I'm not particularly interested in the near-death experience unless it includes, again, veridical perception that shouldn't take place even when the person was, awake and alert. Say again, if the veridical perception is a serial number on the back of a piece of equipment that is facing away from them, they wouldn't be able to see if they were sat up in bed, even looking at it. Some kind of temporal or spatial impossible perception, which would indicate that they are out of the body. And whether they have brain activity or not, that perception should still not happen. Look to Dr. Gary Habermas, who's done a lot of research into near-death experiences. There are many of these cases.
That's actual, real, legitimate death. Like, there's no coming back from that. So actual death is the prevention of sodium and ion transmission across the nucleic cell membrane in the neurons in your brain. That's actual, real, legitimate death. Like, there's no coming back from that.
For some reason, I thought that she said that flat brain waves is equal to is equal to death, and there's no coming back from it. But that's not what she said, so that's fine. I just wanted to make sure.
So when they're on the operating table, that's a different type of what you would call near-death experience. Like, there is a gradient of what people would consider those to be, like in the circumstances where they take place. In almost all circumstances where they take place, though, there is no sort of cooperation. There's folklore about this sort of cooperation that if you dig into it, you really can't find it being substantiated in any.
When she says, what was the term she used?
Cooperation. There's
cooperation. I think she means it probably means the same thing, but I've heard the use of the word corroboration over cooperation. So verification. So people that are able to verify the perception that took place. There are many cases of this. Have a look at, again, Titus Rivas and et al. With The Self Does Not Die. There are other publications in academic journals. Have a look at the Virginia Department of Perceptual Studies, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, I believe, touch upon it, but I'm not certain. I think they're more psi phenomena. But many papers by Dr. Bruce Grayson, among others, do show that there are a significant number of corroborated third-party verified veridical perceptions that take place, as well as those that take place when we know what the brain was doing, especially those after cardiac arrest, because in cardiac arrest, we know that a very short time after the heart stops, the EEG flatlines, and I'm talking within, I can never remember exactly, but 15 seconds, I think, is when the brain flatlines. And after that, we know that conscious experience should not take place by our current understanding of EEG to consciousness correlations. And there are many that take place far after the 15 seconds. And that's what's interesting, and have been third-party verified. Again, Titus Rivas, The Self Does Not Die. You look at Gary Habermas's work, the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, among many others. You can find them. They are there in a substantial number.
Folklore about this sort of cooperation that if you dig into it, you really can't find it being substantiated in any sort of real and meaningful way. It's not really repeatable, and it's
Understandable position, but I'm going to take an estimate here and say that Shannon hasn't really dug deep into the literature about it and the actual science done for many years on the subject. No fault of her own. This isn't really her area of interest, so she's probably heard about these few cases in the circles that she exists within. Mainly, I think, the atheistic kind of community and those, which of course would have the opinion that Shannon does. However, if you dig into the literature, you'll see that there is a lot more in-depth work done on this phenomena and many others in scientific manners, and are very very substantiated indeed.
I beg your pardon?
It's impossible. You can't reproduce something that's happened spiritually that happens miraculously, right?
Well, you're just
But you're assuming that these things are miraculous, and they're not. I mean, they're special, they're rare, but they do occur, and they are natural within the human race. You know, regardless of what religion you are, what color you are, what ethnicity you are, it's human wide. So it's a natural phenomenon of being human. It's just not explained yet. There's a difference, because this is a scientific question, not one of religion or miracles.
assuming. Oh, but Kevin, you're just asserting that it's happening miraculously. There's mundane explanations for these types of brain events, right?
There are not. The veridical perception, among other phenomena of near-death experience which are unexplainable, there are no mundane explanations as of yet. It's still a work in progress. Look at Dr. Bruce Grayson's. Hang on. So here's a very good resource for anybody. This is the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. This is all the academic publications that have been done by them. Let me just filter to near-death experiences. There's all sorts of anomalous experience, most of which I'm sure Shannon and Phil would consider nonsense, but again are very well researched. Anybody would think these things are nonsense without having dived deeply into the research and having the full context of why people believe what they do. So let's go to near-death experiences. There are many, 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 many academic publications. The one that I was going to bring forward was this one here, which is quite old now, 2012, but it does still very much cover all the explanations that are currently being brought forward, or at least the majority of them in physical terms. There's young Bruce. So this one goes through all the kind of current explanatory models of physical explanations for near-death experiences and describes why they're insufficient to explain all the data that's currently available. And this is still relevant to today. There is another very interesting study that's worth looking at, which is much more recent, 2019. Neurochemical Models of Near-Death Experiences, a large-scale study based on the semantic similarity of written reports. This one goes into effectively, as it says, a semantic comparison. So that basically means, for anyone that's not familiar, a comparison between kind of the language that people use to describe near-death experiences versus other visions during neurochemically activating substances. That's probably not a term, but you know what I mean. Dimethyltryptamine and ketamine and various different things like that. And it compares near-death experiences to those experiences and shows the differences and similarities between them. Very interesting read, worth looking at. So let's carry on.
So there really and legitimately are mundane explanations for these types of brain events. I'm a proponent of it, that there's a receptor in your brain that's on most of your neurons, and it's called sigma-6. And the sigma-6 receptor is just, and people may argue with me on the minutiae of this from a neuroscience perspective, but I think that this makes sense. Like, if there's a chemical that's endogenous in your system that's called DMT, and some people call it like the spirit chemical or whatever, but it actually helps to fluctuate allowing oxygen in and out of your neurons. So it's just something that in our system allows oxygen in and out of our neuronal cells. So and it's also an hallucinogen. It's both of those things. It does both of those things. And it's produced in just really small quantities generally. But if you have oxygen deprivation, in order to prevent something called apoxia. And apoxia is when your cells no longer have enough oxygen to stay alive. A little bit more DMT is produced, and your sigma-6 receptors start to suck the DMT in a little bit more as part of a survival mechanism. And because DMT is a natural hallucinogen, when your sigma-6 receptors are attempting to prevent cell hypoxia in your neurons, they will start to take the DMT in order to regulate, to prevent that hypoxia, which can cause a hallucinogenic experience.
So I think, to put it in a simple way, this sigma-6 receptor usually allows oxygen into the brain through or via DMT. I don't know about this, I'm just going by what I understand. I might be completely wrong. During apoxia, when there's no oxygen available to the brain, the sigma-6 receptors will allow more DMT to come through as a survival mechanism, which could account for NDEs being hallucinatory as a result of DMT. There isn't evidence to suggest that DMT is available in necessary quantities to allow such trips, I suppose, to take place. There's been studies done on rats to show that there's I can't even remember. I'm trying to think back to when I spoke to Pascal Michael. He did mention, I believe, even in the rats, it wasn't a sufficient amount to cause hallucinatory experiences for them. Or it was, but it wasn't ever scaled up to human levels. I can't remember, but have a look. There are various studies on this. I'm sure you can find the original study in the rats as well. Point being, it's never been demonstrated that DMT exists or can exist in the human body naturally at the required level to allow for a hallucinogenic experience. One argument Shannon could certainly make, and the neurochemical possibilities paper that I just linked a minute ago also shows strong similarities between near-death experiences, but also strong dissimilarities. So using DMT alone to explain NDEs are not sufficient. However, Shannon could very reasonably argue that DMT is only a part of the cocktail that could allow for near-death-like experiences. So if ketamine, for instance, is also released into the brain, and I believe ketamine is closer to the near-death experience than DMT is, based on this schematic study, then you could say that many of the aspects of DMT mixed with many aspects of ketamine can allow for the full near-death experience, I suppose. Again, from a subjective point of view, that seems perfectly reasonable. We'd have to demonstrate that these chemicals are released in sufficient amounts to allow that to happen. However, theoretically, it would make perfect sense. Again, until you have that veridical perception aspect included, when all of that, although the subjective part of it may be neurochemical, being able to see something you shouldn't be able to see even if you're awake, and then having that verified by third parties, the self does not die by Titus Rivas, and many other studies by Grace and others at the University of Virginia, for instance, then that model no longer works. So, but you could reasonably argue that that could be the case for the subjective aspects. But once you have veridical perception involved, then you need to question whether there may be more to this than simple brain, well, not simple, very, very, very complicated neurochemical interactions, but maybe there's something beyond that going on here.
And that hallucinogenic experience.
And that's not necessarily God. Not necessarily not God, but it's not necessarily God. It's not necessarily a miracle. It's more likely another part of nature, or it most likely is another part of nature because it's prevalent throughout the whole of the human race, a part of being human, part of nature that is yet unexplored and undiscovered.
Experience from a perceptual perspective can seem exceptionally real. So that's a mundane explanation from a neuroscience perspective that accounts for everything that you've just said without you providing external cooperation. So you're just asserting at this point that it's some sort of magic spirit thing based on things that you've heard that seem to affirm what you already believe and sound cool to you without actually looking into the science of what brains do.
Yeah, she's perfectly right. Kevin is using the top-down kind of approach to this. He already has a predetermined belief. I'm guessing he's religious that God exists, and therefore near-death experiences, which, granted, are unexplained by current science, but because of that, they must be God. It's a God of the gaps argument. That's not the way to do science. It's to look at, as Shannon says, all the neurophysiological possibilities to what could cause this, but it is also to be open to those phenomena that take place that do not fit in with that neurochemical explanation, and therefore new theories, new hypotheses must be created, tested, and examined, I suppose. And that's why peer review is so important.
All these chemical reactions you're talking about are randomness, right?
Whoa! No, they're not. Oh my God, they're incredibly regulated. Are you kidding? They're not random at all.
You need to go
That annoyed her.
back 2 minutes.
She's right, though. They're certainly not random. They are very, very complicatedly organised in the human brain. There's trillions of neurons all talking to each other in very complicated ways, which correlate strongly to our conscious experience and our experience of mind. Correlated, but not necessarily causational. Again, it's that old chestnut of correlation versus causation, which is why, to me, I have no problem with the theory that the brain produces consciousness, because there is evidence to support it, correlatory evidence. However, there's no mechanism as to how non-conscious matter, i.e. the brain, could create a feeling of being. Equally, there's very strong evidence in correlatory terms to suggest that the brain acts as a filter or a transceiver or a translator of consciousness. However, there's no mechanism yet as to how consciousness could exist outside of the brain. I think that explanation is more likely due to the nature of the evidence that I've seen and the way I've interpreted it. However, there are no mechanisms for either hypotheses. It seems that the brain creating consciousness theory is the most commonly believed. That's the current paradigm. However, we must be open to these other possibilities, and especially this other possibility that consciousness exists outside of the brain, but the brain is necessary, because that is equally as evidenced, I would say more so, than the brain creating consciousness idea, but neither have a mechanism as to how they could be fundamentally.
It's because everything you just said got ignored. Cold, hard,
It's not
ignored.
random.
Absolutely amazing.
It's you can predict it.
Kevin, I'm impressed. That was the most.
Then if it's not random.
The greatest lack of understanding of what was just said to you, I think I may have ever heard on the show.
Oh man,
button pushing.
But it's not random though. Like it's
conscious, comprehensive experiences. This isn't just some
Calm
oops
down,
in their
Kevin.
brain. Doctors have these experiences, have had these NDEs themselves. When their brain dead, heart stopped. This person.
I'm so
awareness.
Yeah.
They're having an awareness.
I don't know that you necessarily heard anything about, like, I'm giving you an actual physiological explanation for these types of experiences that people have that seem like very vivid and lucid and real for those people. And there's a physiological explanation. I mean, and it's one of many, like that's just one of many explanations. It's one that I think makes a great deal of sense. And I'm sure there may be even some neuroscientists that kind of disagree with me on that. But to me, it makes a lot of sense because apoxia is something that happens when you go through oxygen deprivation, and those receptors would become more active. And a chemical that,
Yeah, I wouldn't bother Shannon. He's not going to understand what you're saying. This is an example of someone who's so far entrenched in a belief that anything that goes against their belief is confirmation bias. Anything that goes against their belief will be kind of semi-consciously, unconsciously ignored. It's not any fault of Kevin's. Anyone brought up with that kind of strong belief will do the same. It's the way humans are psychologically, very naturally. But we must be careful if we're looking at these questions, which are very, very big questions, and certainly full respect to Shannon's beliefs, but are not fully explained. We must go with not only a skeptical mind, but also a very open mind to say that there are these phenomena that are unexplainable, veridical perception and various others, which I won't go into now, but that many of the aspects of it could also be explained, in theory, through neurochemical means. However, again, we're looking at correlatory data here because we'd have to first understand how non-conscious matter, the brain, could give rise to the sense of being, not necessarily the content of that sense of being, the mind, because we know that the brain is very closely linked to it. And again, we must also be open to the possibility that maybe the brain is kind of an intermediary between some form of consciousness we don't understand yet and the physical world. That is equally unmechanismed because we don't know how consciousness could exist outside of the brain. We only have to weigh, or we only are able to weigh the evidence one way or the other. Again, to me, the latter explanation seems more plausible to me.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Science
Kevin,
can either
Kevin,
build
you brought up the word miracle. Can you define
religion.
a miracle?
Good question.
A miracle is when something happens that we can't explain and understand or detect why it happened.
So by that definition, what could I? So for that definition, I suppose lightning would have been a miracle many, many years ago when we didn't understand it. The sun would have been a miracle because we didn't understand it, and they probably were seen like that. But that's due to ignorance of our current, because we're not very, very scientifically advanced, because there's still a hell of a lot we don't understand. But we're much more scientifically evolved now than we were back then. So things that were unexplained, miracles by Kevin's definition back then, are no longer miracles because they are now explained. But that doesn't make sense because therefore they were never miracles because they were explainable. So I would have said miracles are something that are unexplainable by humanity and by science in all of its forms. And by science, I don't mean physicalism, the belief that, or I suppose the theory, the worldview that everything is essentially matter at its foundation. But that science also includes post-material science, maybe where maybe in a few years we realise that that's not the case and there are other parts of nature, which I suspect is the case. But effectively, anything that is completely inexplainable by any understanding of science now and forever would be a miracle, if that makes sense. But certainly something that isn't understood is not a miracle. It's just not understood yet.
But like I explained it.
Well, I'm just, it's curious because so miracles only happen when you're ignorant. Is that what you just said?
Mm.
Well, yeah, we're very ignorant human beings, aren't we?
Okay.
We don't know
So
shit.
I mean, that's the first thing we've agreed on, I think.
Yeah.
Probably, Kevin.
The
Yeah.
absence of knowledge is part of the definition of what a miracle is. That's the ground you
Yeah.
want to stand.
That would be true. That would have to be part of the definition because that is what a miracle is. It's something that happens that is unexplainable to humans. So certainly being unexplainable or being unexplained is an aspect of it, but not the whole aspect of a good way to define it, I'd say. I'm just pulling this off the top of
When
my head.
things
I don't
at this
I'm
point,
just a yes. I meant it as a yes or no, Kevin. I mean, is that you said it. I'm double checking because I'm going somewhere with this. You're saying that your lack of understanding of something that happened is part of what makes something a miracle.
Yes, I'd say that's true.
doctors,
If that's
PhDs, highly
so, he can't answer the question because the problem is that if that's your position that you stated, I'm just taking your words. If that's your position, then miracles are more likely to happen the more ignorant you are. And I don't mean stupid, just ignorant. If you're ill-informed.
So Phil's saying if miracles, if an essential part of miracles is the statement that they are unexplainable, then it would follow that miracles are more likely to happen the less you know about the world. Let's think about that. Don't know if I'd agree with that per se. I'd agree if he said that everything that constitutes a miracle is something that we haven't explained. If that is the full definition of a miracle, then yes, the more ignorant we are, the more likely we are to experience what we understand as a miracle, which is why, as I say, the sun and lightning was a miracle, was considered a miracle in ancient humanity, but isn't so now. So yes, I'd say, Phil, if our definition of a miracle is fully encompassed by the phrase something we don't understand, then yes, what you're saying is true. But if we take miracle as only being partly something we can't understand, which would be true for something we can't ever understand, then that's not necessarily true, I don't think. Maybe I'm thinking about it wrong.
You don't have the information. You don't know how the sun comes up in the morning. You don't know why the moon has a light. If you're ignorant, the more things you're ignorant of, based on your definition, the more likely you are going to see a miracle. I just think that's not a good place to be.
well, you think we're going to explain miracles one day when we get more technology, or?
You have
We
to
don't
just
think that
tell me if they
miracles
happen.
happen. I think that maybe that's a disconnect. We don't
But
think
Kevin-
miracles are. We think that there's explanations for things that we attribute as miracles.
Thanks for confirming that what I said was correct. because your follow-up was not addressing anything that I said, but reaffirming, oh, maybe someday when we know more things, we'll show that miracles didn't happen. Yeah, when we know things, miracles don't happen.
You think, but
It was your definition.
It's another thing like spirit, like psychics and mediums.
So this guy is desperately now trying to save his position, which to some degree could be savable, I suppose, but then I suppose this wouldn't necessarily be his position. Definitely, especially in the death experiences, it wouldn't be his position that these are miracles if he was more aware of the research and the science done behind it. He's going to talk about psychics and mediums now. They're going to completely discount them. Reasonably so. Again, if you haven't really looked into the research done, for psychics, I don't know. Most likely, well, definitely most of them are nonsense. However, there are quadruple blinded studies done by Julie Byshell and the Windbridge Institute, among others, of evidential mediumship. So that is something that is scientifically a valid phenomenon that has been shown to take place, and as of yet is unexplained. Many people just say it's not true, it's obviously not true, the science must have been performed badly, or it just can't be. Again, not people who are familiar with the research, but are very dogmatically sealed in a position. Not saying that Shannon and Phil are, I'm just saying they're probably just not aware that these studies have taken place.
So much evidence of spirituality.
Wow, you think psychics are real?
That's
Mediums are
not
real?
good evidence. Like, you and I have different standards of evidence, evidently, like just drastically and dramatically different standards of evidence.
It's the most amazing thing for me to hear that someone is converting or comparing their religious experience.
Psychics I don't know about. Psychics are, so for anyone that doesn't know, the difference between psychic and medium is a medium is somebody who allegedly can act as a medium between spiritual beings who are no longer incarnated on Earth to those of us who are. So communication can take place through that medium. The medium can receive communications from these external non-physical souls or spirits or entities, and then translate that into our language, into a comprehensible form of communication to us. Psychics allegedly can read energies, which the definition of energy is quite difficult, because energy is essentially the potential for matter to do work in a physicist's kind of language. That's what it means. So again, going down the rabbit hole of defining energy, but let's just say energy, spiritual energy. Psychics can read spiritual energy to determine more about the individual, their future, their past, or whatever else. That I don't necessarily believe happens, but then again, there may be research on it I'm not familiar with. I haven't looked. I believe there is, but I personally am not familiar with it, and my experiences of psychics has usually been very vague, very guessable, and very general, so I'm not holding my breath on psychics yet. But again, don't take my word for it, don't take Shannon or Phil's word for it. Go to the scholars who have researched this and spend their livelihoods researching one particular area and specialising in it. That's where you get the good information, not YouTube, not from Kevin from Canada.
To a psychic or a medium, that's profound. That's the level of evidence you need to believe that something is real is way lower than the average person.
Depends, and I keep stopping it, but depends on how Kevin would see what he would consider evidence from mediumship. If he was to go to a medium or watch mediums on the television, God forbid, because that's not good evidence. Anything on YouTube, anything on the television can be edited and has been edited, and is usually edited very favourably. You don't know what's going on there. There may be bugs, wired bugs, there may be people listening in, there may be forms that you have to fill out which people can get information from. Unless you're there and you've done everything you can to make sure there's no information that's been given by you, you can never take anything from on face value. And that's why, I don't look to people like, I don't know, the Long Island medium, Teresa Caputo, or anyone like that. I look at the studies done in the Windbridge Institute on evidential mediumship, because they had controls, they had proper data collecting protocols, and that's the sort of thing you need to look at to determine evidence. If Kevin wants to take these kind of television mediums and experiences that he's had himself, probably without proper controls in place, as evidence, that to me is weak. Might be strong enough for him to kind of be convinced, fair enough, but in terms of just establishing a genuine phenomenon, that kind of evidence is not strong enough for me. Again, look to the professionals who research this professionally.
The only way we can detect God is with our minds, with our consciousness, because that's the only way God exists.
That's the only way
That's
to
the
detect
only way
anything.
we can detect anything, though.
So,
It's
Me and
literally
Shannon
the
are
only way
pretty
we can
closely
detect
thinking
anything.
together.
thinks God is real and they die. Does God die too? Because you just said he only exists in the mind.
Good question.
Hey, well,
Well, in the individual mind or in the human mind? That's something to think about.
I believe
I don't believe God exists at all. I mean, not in the religious sense. I believe there's a part of nature one could call God that is as of yet undiscovered by science. But God, as in religious gods that are currently commonly understood, I don't think so. Maybe wrong, but I don't think so.
the New Testament is literal, and it is verifiable.
Literal.
That is a
Literal?
hard right turn. Hard right turn.
Literal? It's literal? The definitions of how we should beat our slaves are literal. The fact that you should leave your family and sell your goods and even sell your clothes and buy a sword so you can follow Jesus, who doesn't
It
bring
would be a very strange
peace and
reality
joy.
if
He
the
brings
Bible was
a
literally
sword and
true.
he separates families. You think all of that is, first of all, literal, and then I'm assuming you think that shit's a good idea, that we should sell our clothes and buy a sword. That's where you're going.
You got to put it in context. You got to take this in context.
Well, that's not
It's always
literal
in
then.
context. Did
That's
Jesus make
contextual.
water into wine?
And it is always in context.
Water into wine, would that fit the definition of miracle that I thought of earlier? Because, well, you'd never know, because science could always evolve to a point where something like that is possible. And Jesus could have been harnessing some technology from the future, come back in time and use that technology to chemically transform that water into wine by some process we don't understand yet. So, could miracles ever actually exist then, theoretically? I don't know. That's an interesting one. I don't think Jesus was a time traveller. I don't think he turned water into wine.
Well, I don't know. Do you want to get a buzz on with dinner? Or are you going to drink water or wine? You got to put things in context. Like, come on.
Okay, Kevin. All right,
Yeah,
all right. I think we're done now. Like, just think about what I said. Maybe listen back, because I think it does explain what your potential evidence was. Like, with using a mundane explanation for something that you're attributing as a miracle that is just, a common
Yeah.
occurrence given what we understand about brain chemistry.
Shannon,
I'm gonna let you go though. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Have a delightful afternoon, evening,
I
whatever
feel-
time it is for you.
So that was the Atheist Experience 2611 with Shannon Q and Phil Ferguson. So I don't know much about Phil, but he did things in a different way than I would, maybe a bit more confrontational, a bit more condescending than I would be. I can understand why, to some degree, if you're working on a show like this and you constantly get barraged with kind of, I suppose, arguments that to you seem very weak and very, very unsupported, as Kevin's are generally to people who are more scientifically literate about this kind of stuff. And again, not any fault of Kevin's, he's probably just never been exposed to the ways of thinking that science and philosophy and all these things require. Shannon made some very, very good points, and her explanations of neurochemical explanations of the subjective aspects of near-death experiences were perfectly reasonable, and many people have brought forth such theories, and again, they're very reasonable. However, when you have phenomena that can't be explained by any form of neuroscientific explanation, such as veridical perception that shouldn't even take place while we're awake and active, that's when you hit a brick wall, and we may have to start considering the possibility that there may be more to consciousness and perception than the workings of the physical brain, although it is certainly necessary to some degree, or at least correlated very, very closely with the experiences we have in this life. At the foundation, the important thing to remember is that there is no mechanism at all, no understanding of how non-physical matter, no matter how complicatedly arranged and interconnecting, can produce a feeling of being. So the evidence for near-death experiences, the evidence for anomalous experiences, the evidence for all the correlations of brain activity and consciousness are strong evidence in support of the brain creating consciousness, but it is also strong evidence that the brain is an intermediary, a necessary intermediary between the physical world and some non-local form of consciousness. that theory also does not have a mechanism as to how consciousness could exist outside of the brain. Both are equally supported, both are equally unmechanismed. So we now look at the data, look at the evidence gathered from that data, and determine which theory is the most plausible. For me, it's that the brain is not necessarily in producing consciousness. So thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything that they discussed that you'd like to know about. Let me know if I'm wrong on anything, or maybe there's something else I should read in regards to the opinions I have that could further them. If you have any other suggestions for things you'd like my opinions on, videos, articles, or blog posts or anything, feel free to either email me or drop them in the comments or wherever else you can find me. And I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.